I wanted to follow up with the Einsatzgruppen that I just butchered trial, because you mentioned the word justice. What is justice? And you mentioned that there were 22 people who were tried, and you based it on military rank and education. And yet there were 3,000, I think you said, that were involved in the killings. What about that other 2,978? It's kind of a two-part question. Do you think trying the 22 was justice, and what happened to the other ones? What do we?
I think that's a very profound question. You're never going to have perfect justice. In criminology, and I was trained in criminology, the best you can hope for is to deter some of the crime by societal changes where necessary, by using the deterrent effect of punishment or imprisonment. And it's a mistake to think in terms of justice, because these defendants were, by chance, the defendants. These are the ones we had in the cage at the time we had to move forward. The other 3,000 were also mass murderers, some directly, some from a distance, some never left the office. But they're all part of a vast conspiracy to murder large numbers of other people. And that still exists today. And it's part of government policy. I said a plural there. Our government and other governments have a policy to kill large numbers of civilians they don't even know. They try to not kill civilians unless, of course, they can call them terrorists or something like that. Then they label them, and then they say, well, that's okay then. Or they kill a lot of innocent civilians, and they say, well, that's collateral damage. As though, oh, that's okay, it's only collateral damage. Certainly the people are convicted. It was not unjust to punish them as severely as possible. I didn't ask for the death penalty. Not that I'm opposed to death penalty in principle, I'm not. But it was so inadequate to kill one guy who's responsible for killing 10,000. You know, where does the justice lie? Build the principle. That will protect people in the future. And so when all of this had calmed down a bit, the capturing of the criminals, witnessing of the crimes, the compensation programs, my mind turned then to trying to create a more just society. And that means more than just picking out a few people who commit crimes. It means building new ethical standards so that killing itself is not treated as a glorious thing as it is today. So I can only give you a simple answer to your question. I would not have tried somebody if I thought it was unjust to sentence him to death. I would have thought it was wasteful to just limit it to that. And it would be distracting to just let them feel, well, if we sentence them to death, it's all over. That's just the beginning. These were guys, normal human beings. The murderers would normally have gone through life as respected citizens, and they became mass murderers. I'm talking of Ollendorf, my lead defendant, father of 5 children, educated doctor. I had doctor's degrees. I had one who studied for the ministry. But the guys who were doing the shooting, they went home to their babies and to their mothers, their wives, and their sweethearts, you know? And that's the reality of it. So how do you approach that problem? Where do you find justice in this kind of a world? And my own conclusion has been, and that's why I've dedicated the rest of my life to that, you have to create a more peaceful and humane world. And you can only do that over a long period of time, because we have all been trained. Since civilization began, war has been glorified as the way to power and glory. And we've got to turn that around, particularly in the nuclear age, and nuclear weapons are already obsolete. Today we have cyberspace weapons. We can kill anybody, any place on the planet, all that. So the need is greater than ever before to stop glorifying war. There's nothing glorious about war. It's hell. It's terrible. And I can get quotations for that from Eisenhower and from MacArthur and every military commander. There's nothing glorious about war. If you have to protect your particular values, there must be ways of doing it short of killing people and nothing to do with it. That's what's happening now. The current system is that if the heads of state are unable to agree, what do? They take young people like you, boys and girls, and they send them out to kill other young people like you, whom you don't even know, who may never have done you any harm, may never have done any harm to anybody. And you kill as many as you can, and they kill as many of you as you can. And then they each go home and declare a victory, and then they rest for a while, then they start again. That's the current system. I think it's not only crazy, it's homicidal, it's genocidal, it's terrible. So how do you change that? Well, you have to change the way people think. You have to teach them the value of every human life, regardless of their color or their creed or their political persuasion. You must learn tolerance, and you have to have education beginning at the earliest levels, beginning in the religious schools and proceeding all the way up to the high schools and the graduate schools, and writing books on it and clarifying what the law is, that it's a crime against humanity to go and kill people when you know innocent people will be killed, and it's a punishable crime. But we are just in the process now of building the institutions we need. The United Nations Charter outlined, after about 100 million people had been killed, they may say, well, there were only 50 million killed or 70 million. I know from my personal experience, we don't know how many people were killed in war, because I've seen them shoveled with bulldozers into holes, and how many people died of heartbreak, and how many people died of disease, and all the rest of it. So after 100 million people or more were killed, we come up with a United Nations Charter, led by the United States, I'm proud to say, and then we ignored it. We have the charter called for the minimum spent on armament. They suggested a disarmament program. If we could cut back on our disarmament, the money we could save on that, which today is billions every day, could use eliminate the causes of the discontent, which causes people to be willing to kill and die for their particular cause. Where is the disarmament? There's none. It called for an international criminal court. We're just beginning now with a prototype court. When the International Criminal Court was created in The Hague now, and I worked on that ever since Nuremberg, I wrote books on defining aggression, on enforcing international law and international criminal courts. The Security Council set up its own courts to deal with Yugoslavia, because 10,000 women had been raped in the former Yugoslavia. So the American women said, you got to do something, you got to do something. The United States was not in favor of an international court, so they set up a Security Council court to deal only with that particular crime. I was working to set up courts, international courts, which would define aggression and crimes against humanity, and would hold accountable the leaders who are responsible, not the individual soldier who goes out to carry out an order because he thinks his country's safety depends on it, but hold the individual leaders who make the policy accountable in a court of law. If they have a good justification, state it. If they're innocent, state it. If there's justified self-defense, it's permissible under the United Nations Charter. It's an inherent right. So I've been trying to create these missing links. We have come a long way in defining the laws. We have created an international criminal court. Too expensive, very difficult to do, because they have to go into foreign territories, they have to learn the language of the tribes, and so on. They have to catch the people who are hiding in the woods and protected by the government. And then there are no precedents. And then they have the language problems of translation. All of that, we don't have staff who understand the legal consequences of that. However, when they finally get to the conclusion of their first case against Mr. Lubanga was in Africa, and he was collecting children to help him fight in his particular battle. Children means anybody under the age of 15. He would go to the village, and say, well, we need food, we need this. They didn't have anything to give me. He said, well, you got a daughter there, I'll take her. You got a son, I'll take him. That's a crime. So he was being tried for that. And as they got toward the end of the trial, the chief prosecutor, Marino Ocampo of Argentina, called me up, sent me a letter, and said, Ben, we want you to do the closing statement. And I did. So I came up to The Hague, and I made the closing statement for the prosecution in their first trial. So I was then 92 years old. So if your kids are looking for an easy career with lots of work, you may look elsewhere. But I've never regretted doing what I do, because I have the satisfaction of knowing that I'm on the side of the angels, and that what I'm saying and what I'm doing is right. And if I thought it was wrong, I wouldn't do it. And I need help. I need help from young people particularly, because it will take generations of new thinking, tolerance, compassion, compromise. This is the things we have to build up on in order that if we have a difference, and there will be differences, and there'll be honest differences of reasonable people, of how you deal with various problems. You don't solve those problems by going out and killing a lot of people that had nothing to do with it in the first place. You solve it by going to a court and you're seeing which side is right. The present system whereby each side decides for himself which one is right, that's crazy. Because the protagonist, each one is going to be sure that what he's doing is right, and the other guy is the one who's the villain who's doing it wrong. That's the current system. The plaintiff can't be the judge at the same time. It's a conflict of interest. But we haven't gotten to that point of civilization yet. We need young people to do that. It takes a long time to change the way people think and feel about strongly held ideals. We haven't recognized, and policymakers haven't recognized, that you cannot kill an ideology with a gun. It's a crazy idea. When you go and you kill a guy because he's trying to kill you because he thinks you are threatening what he holds more valuable in life. We look to the teachers, all the teachers of history. Look to history. Where has it gotten us? More and more people getting killed in a world which is much more dangerous than it ever was. I have it on very reliable authority, and I had it about maybe 10 years ago from a conference in St. Petersburg, Russia. I was having breakfast with an American general. He and I were the only Americans there. And I asked him, what is it you're doing? What are you working on now? He said, I'm working on the cyberspace problem. You know, we can now cut off the electrical grid from any city on the planet. You know, I didn't know that. Has anybody figured out how long it would take to kill everybody on the planet? Well, if you took a city like Washington and you cut off the electrical grid, the water didn't run, the lights went out, the computers didn't work, the telephones didn't work, how long would it take for everybody to die? I said, I figured, well, it would depend on the condition of the person. Might live a week, might live 2 weeks, you know. That was about 10 years ago. Today, my friends, be careful. Cyberspace can launch a drone with nobody in it. You drop a bomb where your cyberspace sensors tell you that's a meeting place for people that you think are bad people. They don't think they're bad people. They think they're great people. They're following their God. You're trying to deprive them of that. They'll kill you for trying to do that because that's their God, and their God is better than your God. But what we don't realize is that for the 48 people who we didn't intend to hit, they go home and they say, I was sitting there having tea, and suddenly a bomb comes sent by the Americans, and it killed me, and it killed my husband, it killed my children. I'm going to kill every single American I ever see. I'll poison the wells. I'll tear his eyes out. This is the reaction, and the normal and expected reaction to innocent people sitting at home, and suddenly they get bombed out because you're aiming for somebody else. It's like the Japanese saying comfort women. They set up a system of kidnapping the girls and using them as objects of sexual abuse by Japanese soldiers. And to call them comfort women, every Japanese I've met since then, I say, hey, I know it's not your fault and you didn't do it, but you got a government policy. Talk to your government. It's an imperfect world. We will not have perfect justice at any time. Man has always killed man, but we can try to deter it to a certain amount by the rule of law. And that's what I do with my life. And that's what I continue doing. And that's why I'm sitting here.
I hope I can ask 2 questions, actually.
You can ask as many as you like.
Okay, maybe 3 then, but I'll start with 2. First question, with the 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, how would you describe for students the sort of the legacy of that trial?
Yes, very good question.
You sort of touched on that already.
Excellent question, and a very important question, because Nuremberg sought to bring about a change. The most important thing which came out of Nuremberg was the decision that aggression was the supreme international crime. By aggression, they had defined it, invading another country and taking its territory, and they had a definition which was perfectly adequate for the purpose. And that was a revolution in thinking, because war has always been glorified and legal. After the First World War, you had the Treaty of Versailles. They tried to try the Kaiser for crimes against humanity and the violation of treaties, but war was always legal until Nuremberg. When the judges went into it, and our chief representative was outstanding jurist, best men we had in the country were working on it, said that what had been the practice of using armed force was lawful providing you gave the enemy or the opponent or the target 30 days notice. That was always the practice. If you jumped on them without 30 days notice, it was not right, but if you gave them 30 days notice, you'll go ahead. He said, no more. Justice Jackson, who was our key prosecutor and the key player on all this, he said, no more. We have to use common sense. And he reported to Truman, who was president, and he said, look, the common sense of mankind must also play a role in this. And going to war and killing people is no longer an honorable thing. It's a crime. It's a supreme international crime. Because in every war, women will be raped, and I can testify to that because I saw what happened. When the Russians came into Berlin, every German woman was begging for an American soldier to protect her because rape was part of the policy. Now give it to them. And has always been in all of the wars. So the women's movement, very important. They got the vote for the women. They got equality almost for women. Let them recognize that stopping war making ties in with rape. War making itself being the supreme international crime in which all the other crimes are committed, rape, pillage, robbery, murder, all of that happens under the mantle and the umbrella of war making. Can't say that's legal. Are you crazy in this kind of a world, in a cyberspace world? So we have not yet caught up with our history, with our sociology, with our human rights. We're still in a primitive, cannibalistic age as far as imposing your will on somebody you don't agree with. And I'm trying to build up courts in order to serve as a forum to settle such disputes by peaceful means only, as required by the UN Charter. Required. They all agreed to it. I don't want to suggest that we haven't made progress. We have made fantastic progress. We do have human rights. We have human rights courts in Europe. We have human rights courts in other parts of the world. It is being enforced to a limited extent. We have recognized that you need three things to a peaceful society. You need laws to define what's permissible and what's not. You need courts in order to decide whether they've been violated. And you need a system of effective enforcement. We haven't begun on enforcement yet. Everybody wants to enforce it for himself. You'll never have peace that way. Sorry, friends. You'll never have peace that way. And you've got to start building an effective, independent enforcement system. Because if each person in a combat believes that he has the right to decide who's right and wrong, you have the current system. They will kill each other and decide the one who's left standing. He says he was right. So you have to have an impartial third party of some kind. It doesn't have to be a formal court, but it has to be an independent third party who is respected and trusted by the public to decide who is right and who is wrong. If the parties are the only ones who are there to decide, you've got what you've got. I can't help you.
One of the things that comes up in my classes, and it builds on what Amanda's question of justice and what is justice, is when former Nazis are brought to trial. So very recently, a couple of weeks ago, a 95-year-old man was sentenced to 4 years. And sometimes the students ask, is it worthwhile to do these trials? Should we continue? And I couldn't think of a better person, of course, to ask than you, how you see these trials.
You ask me how I react to the arrest of old Nazis who are caught somewhere in the world today and charged with being accomplices to mass murder because they were guards in the concentration camps. Everybody who worked in the concentration camps was an accomplice to mass murder. I can assure you of that because I saw it, I witnessed it in all of its horror. And no one can say, well, I didn't know, or I was only obeying superior orders, because the German army was never responsible for obeying orders which were illegal. They carried a little book, all the soldiers, and it told them what the rules of warfare were, and it was very explicit. You don't have to obey our order, which is illegal. And it certainly must be seen as inhumane to take an old man who certainly poses no threat in the future and hold him liable, try to imprison him for crimes which occurred 50 years ago or more. On the other hand, you have to look at the position of the victims. And the victims are still, those who are still alive, or either victims themselves, or their families were victims and killed. Ask yourself, and I ask myself, how would they react to know that a guard in the camp where their mother was killed, or their father was killed, or their husband, or their whoever, their children were killed, to know that they are ignored and not put on trial or just allowed to roam free, they would feel betrayed, and rightfully so, that the world was so disinterested and not prepared to even assert a charge against the people who were, to some extent, certainly responsible for what happened. When I put in the scale the interests of the perpetrators and the interests of the victims, my sympathies always go with the victims, whether it be international crime or whether it be local crime. There is always this choice, and as between the two, knowing what the victims have sustained and knowing that the others were to some extent responsible, even though it's an unkind thing, in practice we know he'll be out in no time and probably will never even get to trial, never be arrested for his crimes. And I think we have to demonstrate the principle that his deeds were so horrible that they will never be forgotten. There is no statute of limitations for mass murder. That hasn't changed. The law has changed on that. And I think it's appropriate to charge him with crime if he was in a position where the crimes were being committed by everybody in there, and have him answer in a court of law.
Ben, one last question. You've been through so much, you've done so much. What would you say is your greatest accomplishment?
Fair question. I was a key player. I didn't do it by myself. We were a small team, 5 or 6 people who counted. We set out in response to an invitation from the Catholic Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer of Germany, when he made a public speech saying terrible crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, which gives rise to a responsibility to try to do something about it. Well, what can you do about it? I dealt with that problem. I was then already handling a restitution of identifiable property, real estate, under military government law. So it's very complicated because the man would buy the property at a reduced price or even at a fair price from his German Jewish neighbor, and there was currency conversion in between, and he only got 1/10 back, and the house had been bombed by the British or the Americans, and he'd repaired it and he paid off the mortgage, and all kinds of problems. And we had a conference, began in New York, which I did not attend, but when it was transferred to Europe I did. How do we go about taking advantage of the Chancellor's desire to do something? There were those who said, nothing, let them all drop dead. The only good German is a dead one. And we want no money, we want no blood money. Some felt very strongly about that. So strong that they were prepared to kill those who had a different point of view, including me. So we set about to try to discover on what principles you operate. Approximately 6 million people had been murdered. Do you ask for money for that? If so, how much do you ask for? It didn't take us more than half an hour to discuss that problem. And we said, we never ask for loss of life. Life is not measurable in terms of dollars and cents. Out. How do you measure pain and suffering? How do you measure fear? You can't measure it, but it has repercussions. Delayed syndrome, which I've seen again and again, and I may be one of them, where a person never gets back to normal. And how do you compensate for it? And from a country which was bombed the hell out of them. Nuremberg was in ruins. Bread was rationed. You could have either a beer or bread. There was no work other than cleaning the bricks off the old houses and get compensation for the state of Israel, which had nothing either. The British were intercepting the ships, trying to prevent anybody from going there. They didn't want to antagonize the Arabs. So you had a political turmoil going on. How do you arrange that? Israel, legally, was a state which was not in existence at the time these crimes were committed. How do you get them to have a claim? We figured it out, because it was like a good Samaritan. Somebody gets hit by a drunken driver, a good Samaritan comes and picks him up, rushes him to a hospital, all these problems we thought through, a small group. I would say in the working group, there were a lot of people coming and going, you know, but the real thing is there were 4 or 5 of us who were really, you know, carrying the ball. Then we had to negotiate the laws. And the Bundesentschädigungsgesetz, it's the federal indemnification law, that thick, defining who was eligible, what did you have to prove, and German doctors had to certify it. And you'd get an opinion from the local doctor in Israel. It would be checked by a German doctor, former Nazi doctor, of course, because they were all had to be members of the party. And you set up a machinery for that. And the legal aid societies to help the victims. I was the self-appointed Director General of the Jewish Restitution Success Organization that covered the real estate property. I was also at the same time the Director of the Claims Conference, which was the group of Jewish organizations, leading Jewish organizations, which was the negotiating partner, technically. And also I set up a big legal aid society called the United Restitution Office. I was the director of these 3 organizations, over 1,000 people, in 19 different countries. In Israel, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem, we had offices. We had offices in New York, we had offices in Los Angeles, we had offices in Baltimore. We had offices in Montevideo. We had offices all around the world because the claimants themselves, they didn't know how to fill out the claim. You know, they had a big, long claims form. And then on top of it, out of a country which was destitute. And there we did some tricks which we may have to go back to in the United States. I worked with John McCloy, who was the High Commissioner of Germany, a Harvard man. It was the time of Marshall Plan. I talked him into giving me enough money to run the operation. He lent it to me. General Clay was the first guy I talked to on this. He wanted to get the DPs out of there, get them out of Germany, get them out. He said, the Russians may be in here tomorrow. Get them out of here. They're going to be a terrible obstacle. I said, I'll get them out as soon as I can, but you got to get the properties back, you got to give them compensation, you got to get some money into their hands. People have nothing but a tattoo while they're robbed. What do you want from me? You know? So, going through all that with John McCloy, with General Clay, Lucius Clay, who were top-notch guys, really. I get 3 million marks, eventually, keep piling it up. Then my time came to strike. I go to see Mr. McCloy, and I say, sir, I was always deferential. I know I owe you 3 million marks, and I promised that I would repay it. And if you insist, I will. But I don't think it's right. He says, why not? I said, look, this money was spent getting back some of the assets which were stolen from the victims. And morally, I said that should be borne by the wrongdoer and not by the victim. And I said, you have just given back to a convicted war criminal 2 billion marks worth of property, Alfred Krupp, convicted war criminal. We had confiscated all of his properties in the war. McCloy gave it back, part of a clemency action, given back 2 billion marks worth of property to a convicted war criminal. I don't think it's right for you to insist upon the victims paying back. He said, can I do it legally? I said, I have a memo that says I said, okay, the debt is waived. That day I earned 3 million marks from the organization who never thanked me. They didn't thank me, they didn't know about it. When McCloy came to write his memoirs, he called me up and he said, Ben, you remember that stuff about, you know, repaying the money that you borrowed for restitution compensation programs? I said, yeah, I remember it very well. He said, yeah. He said, so do I. He said, you know, I could have gone to jail for that. I said, but Mr. McCloy, I would have gone with you. And it was for a good cause, and we both laughed. We didn't have to go. Okay, this is a story which has never been told. Being able to play a key role in getting compensation from the victims, and for the German government, we also did a very nice thing there. We primed the pump. We said, we know you, everything is bombed out. We'll take locomotives for Israel. We'll take taxi cabs for Israel. The electrical system for Israel, all built up with German equipment. So the German industry got rolling again, got very prosperous. Israel got the goods because you have no money to pay for it. I got a pat on the head when I went home. At this age, I don't think I'll be around to see all these changes, but you can be around. And you've got now these little computers these fantastic things. What a revolution. So I leave the world to you, my friends. And you're lucky you're in a good school like Misericordia, which is based on high moral principles. You're lucky to be there. Be a good student, and don't forget what you learned in school when you go out into the real world. And if the laws don't exist that should exist, make them. If the law doesn't change, change them. I'm looking for people who are ready to think outside the box and with fire in the belly. If you can do that, you'll change the world. Good luck.